Hi everyone, and welcome to my continued exploration of Nimzowicz's classic chess manual, My System. After finishing part 1, the elements, we now move into part 2, the more complicated section, which deals with positional play. Nimzowitsch begins with an introductory chapter entitled Prophylaxis and the Center, where he outlines his conception of positional play and discusses further the hugely complex area of correct central play. The first section details the relation between the elements discussed in the first part of the book and positional play. It becomes clear that Nimzowicz's understanding of positional play is based largely on the knowledge so painstakingly gathered that came with his identification of the elements themselves in the first part of the book. This is particularly true regarding prophylaxis and centralization. The result is that the entire book itself flows very nicely from a thorough understanding of the elements into understanding positional play. However, it should be noted that getting to the core of positional play, as Nimzowitsch understood it, does not come without difficulty and concentration. Specifically, the correct strategy to utilize in the center of the board is very complex, as well as the transferal of the ideas learnt from the elements into positional play itself. Nimzowitsch likens it to a composer trying to adapt a violin sonata for a full orchestra. The theme remains the same, but the piece as a whole gains significantly in depth. For example, let's consider restraint or prophylaxis. In the elements, we looked at ideas such as restraining a passed pawn or holding up a pawn chain that has broken free. This was very useful information, but it was also restricted to a degree. In relation to positional play, the idea of restraint may relate to an entire half of the board. In extreme cases, including a game of Nimzowicz's that we will see in due course, we may even see the entire board, both flanks and all corners, taken up with the theme of restraint. We will also consider the important issue of maneuvering, which to a beginner may appear as a whole series of apparently senseless moves backwards and forwards in all directions. Any strong player, however, will understand that such maneuvering frequently represents the correct strategy given the position, i.e. making the most of a slight space advantage and the greater freedom of movement for pieces from one wing to the other that it facilitates. After this introductory section, Nimzowitsch moves on to the issue of offences against sound positional play, which of course must be weeded out of our game if we hope to improve. He emphasizes the fact that many amateurs do not seem at ease with the idea of positional play. However, he continues, 20 years of teaching chess showed him that in the vast majority of cases, the issue is one of having an incorrect psychological attitude to the game. In truth, there is nothing mysterious about positional play. A thorough examination of the elements in the first half of My System will give any capable student all the motivation he needs to play with the positional ideas that are covered there in his mind. All that remains is to identify and get rid of the so-called weeds that are strangling his thought process, and then follow the rules laid down in the second section of the book. A widespread misconception that many amateurs have in their mind is the idea that every single move they play must immediately achieve something, i.e. create a threat or defend a threat that our opponent has created. In thinking this way, they neglect to consider all the other possible moves, such as waiting moves or maneuvering pieces to better squares. Nimzowitsch strongly condemns this approach and continues with a definition of positional moves as he understands them. On the whole, they are neither threats nor defensive moves. They are moves that are intended in a wider sense to consolidate one's position via ensuring that our pieces are in contact with the strategically important squares given the position on the board. Nimzowitsch illustrates such moves by comparing the styles of a positional player and a purely combinative player. When such players meet each other over the board, there frequently occurs the following moment of surprise. The combinative player, attacking violently, is expecting one of two counter moves, either a defensive move or a counter-attack, and he's surprised when his positionally minded opponent opts for neither of these, and instead reroutes a piece that instantaneously puts a miraculous stop to the attack that he'd been facing. A similar effect takes place when one player makes a move that protects a square that isn't even under attack. A positional player will make such a move not merely to defend the said square, but because he knows that piece will gain in strength by being in contact with it. He then follows with an example of what he has been saying, one of his own games against a strong amateur, who was fond of opposite castling games with pawn storms and sacrificial attacks. Of course, such an amateurish approach is not going to fare well against the positional might of Nimzowitsch, and it's instructive to see why not. Nimzowitsch had white and opened with e4, then followed e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4, the Scotch opening. E takes d4, knight takes d4, and now d6, which nowadays is considered unsound, although Nimzowitsch felt it was still playable, but only if black follows up correctly, with something like knight f6, bishop e7, castling, and rook e8 to pressure on e4. So play continued, knight c3, knight f6, bishop e2, bishop e7, bishop e3, bishop d7, queen d2, a6. Nimzowicz's opponent begins his ill-advised queenside advance already. After f3, castles, he continues immediately with b5, of course expecting a pawn storm from white, also with g4 and so on, and while he continues the pawn storm on the queen side. However, as Nimzowitsch points out, such an attack by black is not appropriate here, and it was made all the more amusing to him by the aggressive expression of his opponent when making the move, who was clearly thinking, now we can get started. So what is the correct way for white to continue? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video now. Knight d5 is the move, immediately occupying the outpost square on the d file. Faced with this attack on the flank, white doesn't counter on the other flank as many players would expect and play themselves in this position. He instead counters in the center, where as a general rule the play should be significantly stronger and therefore force our opponent into slowing down his flank attack. Black has attacked prematurely here, and in so doing he has in fact given up the center to white upon close examination. Now knight takes e7 and g4 is threatened with a strong attack. So black played knight takes d5, and after e takes d5, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. White is significantly better here. He's taken over the center completely, and black is going to have a difficult time in trying to get any of it back. Play continued, bishop f6, f4, rook e8, and bishop f3 with the rook h e1 to follow, and a big space advantage. Now black's premature b5 push is brought into serious question. He's weakened his queenside very badly and gained nothing as a result. On the contrary, it's going to become a serious endgame weakness. So this is a great example of a simple positional move, knight d5, refuting an attempt at combinative play with b5. The moral of the story, in Nimzowicz's words, is to not always be looking for an attack. Consolidating moves in the broader sense that meet the needs of the position are far more frequently what should be played. Nimzowitsch concludes this section with a comment on the famous idea of the accumulation of small advantages to be exploited in the endgame, which many amateurs and masters at the time considered to be the essence of positional play. Playing in such a way, he said, requires a fine understanding and is very aesthetically satisfying. However, he also adds that such an approach is in no way the most important component of positional play. It's relevant, but not the most important factor. Moreover, in Nimzowicz's opinion, it was difficult to call such a niggardly building up of store of little items admirable. He felt it was more like watching a miser count up his pennies. It's necessary to recognize that there are in fact other things that merit the attention of the positional player, and that these things are far more important than this accumulation of small advantages. So, what exactly are these things, and what is real positional play? Nimzowicz's answer to those questions is short and to the point. Prophylaxis. As already indicated, it's neither attack nor defense that is essential in chess when it comes to move selection. In Nimzowicz's opinion, what is far more important is energetic and targeted prophylaxis. Crucially, it's most important to prevent positionally undesirable possibilities before they emerge. There are two types of such possibilities. Firstly, allowing your opponent to make a freeing move, especially with his pawns. A positional player should aim to position his pieces so that their opponent is unable to play such moves. Of course, it's also vital to ensure that we have judged the position correctly and that an apparent freeing move is exactly that. Sometimes it will be the case that our opponent is opening the game prematurely, or that what appears should be a freeing move actually has little of the intended effect. We will look at them in greater detail later, but it's necessary to have a look at a couple of examples here also, just to get a visual understanding of the concepts in question. Okay, so here is white's move. What's the correct way to play this position? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video now. The first thing to consider in the position is how black is going to free his game. At the moment he is a little cramped, and the light square bishop in particular is inactive. It would be common for black to play e5 in such positions, liberating his game, opening a diagonal for the bishop and putting some pressure on the white center. White has made an attack on the queen side, and the correct way for black to respond is in the center. However, this move e5 has to be carefully prepared, or it will be premature. With this in mind, white can happily play b4 here, instead of rook e1, which would render the e5 push complete lunacy. Because if black now plays e5, it can be proved to be premature. After d takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop f4, knight takes f3, queen takes f3, queen d8, h3. And next will come rook a d1 and the maneuvering of a blockading piece to d4, after which white will definitely have the better game. Black is a tempo short throughout the sequence, and thus it's clear that his attempt at freeing the game was premature. Of course, it's often not possible to prevent our opponent from playing such freeing moves forever, but we should always strive to make the freeing action more difficult to achieve and not become obsessed with the unlikely idea of preventing it outright. Our next example looks at such a case. So, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian game, bishop e7, the Hungarian defense. And now the unusual line d4, d6, d5, knight b8. Unlikely in actual gameplay, but good for illustrating the points that Nimzowitsch was making, i.e. that given the central pawns, white will be playing for c4, c5, and black will be playing for f5, both sides aiming to challenge their opponent's pawn chain from the base. How should both sides thus arrange their pieces? White could aim to prevent the f5 push entirely with, say for example, after knight b8, bishop d3, knight f6, and now h3, and after, for example, castling and g4, to prevent f5. But this wouldn't suit the position. He's badly weakening his king side, where he's going to be attacked anyway, and this gives nothing by way of contribution to his queen side play. So in short, this would be the wrong way to play. Better, instead of this h3 and g4, would be to continue on the queen side immediately instead. After knight b8, bishop d3, knight f6, and c4 straight away. So then, for example, castles knight c3, knight e8, and queen e2, with the idea that after f5 you can play e takes f5, and after bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, knight e4, and a comfortable positional edge. The knight on e4 is great and can be backed up later with other pieces. e4 is going to be the strategical base for white, and the knight there in particular will make his play with a c5 even stronger, because it's attacking these two key squares. And you know, despite allowing black this freeing move f5, white obtains something else concrete in return, and thus his edge is sustained. However, it's important to reiterate the prevention of freeing pawn moves, insofar as it appears necessary and possible, is of the greatest importance for positional play. It is exactly this prevention that we refer to when we talk about external prophylaxis, i.e. prophylaxis with regard to our opponent's pieces. What is more difficult to understand is internal prophylaxis. This is when we must take action to prevent some kind of positional problem that has the potential to be disruptive for our own play. This happens when our pieces are not in sufficient contact with our strategically important points, and it's this phenomenon that led Nimzowitsch to develop his theory of overprotection, i.e. to have more pieces defending such points than there are attacking them. His rule or justification for this can be stated as follows: weak points, and even more so strong points, in short, every point that could be described as strategically important, must be overprotected. The pieces that fulfill this duty are rewarded for helping to overprotect the said strategically important points through the fact that they are well placed when it comes to undertaking other duties. So to express it somewhat dramatically, the importance of the strategic point envelops them in its halo. Nimzowitsch felt that two explanations were above all necessary in relation to this idea of overprotection. Firstly, we should remember the curious circumstances we looked at when analyzing the passed pawn, that blockading squares usually turn out to be good squares in every respect, i.e. when our pieces are on the correct positional squares, it's logical that they will be the most active and effective from those points, regardless of how the game unfolds. Overprotection is an extension of this idea. For example, we overprotect a passed pawn in this example. So here the question is white's defense of the e5 pawn, as the d4 pawn is insufficient for this role because white is intending d takes c5, giving up his base pawn so that he can use the d4 square for his pieces. And Nimzowitsch reached this exact position in a game of his against a man called Gysi, and he continued as follows: knight d2, with the idea that after knight e7 he can play knight f3. And if black increases the pressure on e5 with knight g6, he can play rook e1, increasing the defense of the e5 pawn, despite allowing black the maneuver he wants to play with tempo: bishop b4, c3, bishop a5. Because he wants to bring the bishop to c7 and then play f6, sorry, not c5. So bishop f4, more overprotection. There's little point in black taking the bishop, it would be inconsistent with his previous play. So he castled, now bishop g3, bishop c7, knight g5, and with this move we see an example of what Nimzowitsch was talking about. The supposedly passive overprotecting pieces, the bishop, rook and knight, suddenly display great activity, as will become clear. So rook f e8 defending e6, this is the idea of knight g5, so to prevent f6. Now knight f4, threatening to double the black pawns, and again preventing the f6 push. Gysi played knight h8, now came queen g4 with mounting pressure on the black king. And next came another passive move, knight f8, so rook e3. Now the rook is also active. Black played bishop b6, bishop d8 was probably better. So knight h5, knight hd6, rook f3, rook e7, and now the crusher, knight f6 check. King h8 is the right move. If g takes f6, e takes f6, and white has a crushing attack. He'll get the piece back now due to the tension between the bishops and the attack on the rook. And he actually can't keep the rook from defending the maintain the rook's defense of the bishop, because he's going to get mated with queen h5. And you know, this is a very strong idea in itself, just queen h5 to h6 and mate on g7. So yeah, he's just lost if he does that. So king h8, and now knight f takes h7, knight takes h7, knight takes f7 check, getting them back to peace. And you know, it's a very simple win for white from here. So as we saw, the overprotection of a strategically important point was a good deed done by the pieces in question, and they were rewarded with an increased radius of activity. Okay, Gisa played passively, but the principles are universally true. So we'll look at one more example just to illustrate that. This position was reached by Nimzowitsch with white against Alekhine at Baden-Baden in 1925. Here Nimzowitsch continued with rook a d1, and after rook a e8, the unusual looking maneuver rook d2, followed up with rook f d1, a sequence that I'm certain even strong club players would not have considered, as it doesn't appear to make positional sense. However, Nimzowitsch explains that the point here revolves around the white queen, and also to a lesser extent the d4 pawn, which are the key factors of white's position. Therefore overprotection is necessary. As the game unfolded, it became clear that the rooks were excellently posted for defensive roles from those squares too. So queen g5, rook f d1, bishop a7, knight f4, knight f5, knight b5, bishop b8. After which Nimzowitsch explained the correct way to continue was with rook e2, followed up with the rook d e1, and in his words, the overprotecting pieces would have had their reward. So after this section, Nimzowitsch again emphasizes the fact that we should only, of course, overprotect the strong points of our position, i.e. important central squares that are likely to come under heavy fire, blockading squares as well, and strong pass pawns, and so on. Another point that is sometimes in need of overprotection is a weak pawn at the base of a pawn chain. However, it's important to ensure that we are not deploying our pieces to passive defensive roles when we set up an overprotection, and thus key to such a setup is foreseeing the potential that the overprotecting pieces will have to create an attack later on in the game, or support some other strong positional factor in the game, such as a powerful pawn or an outpost. Okay, that's the end of part 1.